some house rules to get us on track. We are very happy to receive your comments and questions in the chat box throughout the discussion. We will start by listening to the presenters, and thereafter we will be able to take some questions. And we kindly ask you, if possible, to keep your audio muted so that we can reduce the background interference as we have the discussion. And now on to our topic. I've tried to dress the part because I'm very excited to have this conversation. Traditional leaders and municipalities. This has been a contested area for many, many years. Today's topic is traditional leaders, municipalities, and land use management. Who does what? The intersection of the role of traditional leadership in land use allocation and the role of municipalities in land use management often gives rise to tensions. But how do we ensure that the different roles are performed in a manner that does not overlap or interfere with each institution's authority with respect to land benefits and the local community? In today's discussion, we're going to look at the legal framework for land use management, namely the Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act of 2013. We're also going to discuss the ongoing debates about which institution enjoys exclusive land use management powers over land. And we're going to look at observations about the intersection of the practice of the role of traditional leadership and municipalities in land use management. On our panel, we have Xavier Poswa, who is a doctoral candidate at the Dullah Omar Institute. We are also privileged to have Chief Nsika Minenkulu Joyi from the Bayiza Traditional Council, head of the Royal House of Joyi in the Eastern Cape. And we have Professor Yap Defissa, who is the director of the Dullah Omar Institute. For our discussion today, we'll start with hearing from Xavier Poswa, and then we will hear from Chief Joyi, and thereafter we will get some comments from Professor Yap, who is going to be the respondent in the discussion, and then after that we'll open up the conversation. So before we go on to start the conversation with Xavier, may I kindly invite you, we're going to be sharing a link where you can complete your evaluation. It's very important for us to get feedback on the program, on the discussion, so that we can continue to improve. So please make sure you take a chance to complete the evaluation form. And I think it's already been posted in the chat. All right, so let's get right into the conversation. Can I invite you, Xavier, to please kick off the conversation? We want to ask you, what exactly is the legal framework? So this tension has been there for years, but how do we get to understand what does the law say about it? What does Spluma say about it? What does the Constitution say about it? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Michelle, and welcome everybody. As Dr. Michelle has introduced me, my name is Xavier. I'll be presenting the legal framework and some other aspects of it as it pertains to the role of traditional leadership and municipalities in land use management in South Africa. Can I please share my screen, Dr. Michelle? Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, we can see it. I don't know if you want to maybe enlarge the slides.
Yes, is that fine for everyone?
It's perfect. Thanks. Please go ahead.
Yes, because I have limited time, 20 minutes, and I love to talk, I would just go into it. I think someone speaking in the background. Is it my?
We're just going to check from here.
Okay, it's a bit interrupting.
I know myself. Stop forcing.
Should I continue, Dr. Michelle, or are we going to just wait?
Yes, can I please ask Marethi Rabbi, I think, to please put yourself on mute. In the meantime, Xavier, you can continue. We'll try to sort it out in the background.
Yes, so the focus of this webinar will be on these 5 neat points. I will briefly discuss the history of traditional leadership before and after 1994. I think everybody knows that, so I'll just breeze through it. And then I'll talk about the recognition and role of traditional leadership in the 1996 Constitution. And then I'll move on to discuss the policy statements. These are your white papers on local government, as well as your white papers on traditional leadership, which sought to address the intersection, particularly the role of traditional leadership in land allocation. And then I'll move on to discuss two pieces of legislation, amongst others, that deal with the role of traditional leadership. These are your Traditional and Governance Framework Act of 2004, and the big one for purposes of this webinar, the Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act of 2006. And then I'll proffer my concluding remarks, and then that will be it from my side. So let's go into it. The history of traditional leadership. So before 1994, as everyone is aware, or it's good that they are aware, various traditional leaders and regional authorities performed They perform governmental functions in the former homelands. Most traditional leadership, as everybody is aware, it's either they were captured or collaborated with the apartheid regime in implementing its laws and policies. One of these laws or these policies, would be your betterment policy, which was in effect disguised as a way of improving the living conditions of the residents or the Black South Africans that lived in the reserves, whereas it was a policy to strip the remaining wealth in the form of livestock, fertile lands, of the people that lived in the rural areas. However, with the advent of democracy, debates about the role of traditional leadership began to emerge. And then I asked the question as to why. So I'll answer that in the following slide. The reason why is because, as I mentioned, it's the role the traditional leaders played during the colonial as well as the apartheid eras in collaborating with these various regimes in implementing their segregationist as well as nefarious laws, so to speak. So that is the reason why these debates about the role of traditional leadership began, particularly if everyone will recall in KwaZulu-Natal, the relationship between the king back then and the colonial and apartheid regime. Also, at the same time, there were debates about the transformation and role that local government should play. This was a discussion that was ongoing at the same time as the one about the role of traditional leadership. Now, the debate about the role and transformation of local government is as a result of the role that local government also played during the apartheid regime. The role of local government during that era, it played a key role in the implementation of racial segregation through its planning powers, which were mainly circumscribed and directed by the provincial governments during that time. Therefore, since 1994, local government has undergone gradual democratization, with municipalities performing functions previously executed by traditional leaders. Now I ask, what is the implications of this? Now the implication is quite obvious. This gave rise to the first wave of tensions because traditional leaders could foresee that our functions or our role in this democratic era is being stripped slowly but surely, because all of the functions that they performed during the apartheid and colonial era were being subsumed under the municipal councils. So, but this is where we see the first wave of tensions, and this is the reason why traditional leaders since the early 1990s have been insistent on their powers and functions being set out in the constitution or in legislation. As I move forward. Now we'll discuss the recognition and role of traditional leadership in the 1996 Constitution. Now, as everyone will recall, in the 1993 Constitution, the powers and function of traditional leaders were set out in clear and unambiguous terms, particularly the role they would play with respect to the administration of land in the rural areas. However, with the coming into effect of the 1996 Constitution, the role of traditional leadership was watered down, and the powers and functions of traditional leadership were not set out as opposed to the functions, to the powers and functions of municipalities. So what the Constitution of 1996 does is that it recognizes the institution of traditional leadership. It recognizes the practices and procedures as well as systems of traditional leadership, which are observed under customary law. But all those systems which are observed under customary law must be subject to the Constitution. Therefore, as I mentioned, unlike local government, the role of traditional leaders is not set out in the Constitution. Instead, what the Constitution does is that in terms of Section 212, it anticipates that Parliament will adopt legislations to that effect. Sorry. As I mentioned earlier, many of the functions that were performed by traditional leaders during the apartheid era intersected with the functions that are performed by local government in the democratic era. Therefore, after the Constitution of 1996 came into effect, the government went into work to try and address the intersection and to try and address the role that traditional leaders would play in the democratic era. And therefore, around, I think it was in 1997, if I'm not mistaken, the white paper on the local government was issued, and it tried to address the intersection of the role of municipalities and traditional leaders. In one passage, it says that traditional leaders, acting as the head of the traditional authority and as such exercising limited legislative powers and certain executive and administrative powers. Also, traditional leaders would make recommendations on land allocations and settle land-related disputes. If I move forward. Therefore, another paper which also tried to explain the role that traditional leaders would play in democratic South Africa was the white paper on traditional leadership. This was dedicated specifically to traditional leaders, and it was issued in 2003. And this white paper as well, it attempted to define the roles that the institution of traditional leadership may play in democratic South Africa. It said, amongst other roles, that traditional leaders can play a key role in supporting government to improve the quality of the life of the people of South Africa. Traditional leaders must complement and support the work of the government at all three levels. So another piece of legislation, because those were policy statements, in 2004, the Traditional Leadership and Governance Framework came into effect, which then came into operation, which then gave effect to the white paper I just mentioned, which was the white paper dedicated specifically to local government. It also tried to define and allocate functions to the traditional council. It mentioned that these functions would include assisting municipalities in the identification of community needs. And please, ladies and gentlemen, follow the reason as to why I highlighted these words, because in the previous slide, I noted supporting and support with inverted commas. And next slide, I highlight assisting municipalities in the identification of community needs, facilitating the involvement of traditional community in the development or amendment of the IDP, recommending after consultation with the relevant local and provincial houses, as well as participating in the development of policy and legislation at the local level. So therefore, what does this mean? And I explained it I explained this in this slide, is that a key aspect of these functions is that they are of a supportive nature to the clearly defined functions performed by municipalities. I think everybody knows that traditional leaders have long called for their roles to be set out in a clearly and defined manner. In a similar fashion, which the roles or the powers and functions of municipalities have been done in the Constitution, as well as in legislation giving effect to the constitutional provisions of local government. and I continue here, is that all of them are phrased as duties to cooperate, recommend, facilitate, alert, etc. And these functions do not necessarily vest decision-making powers in the council or traditional leaders, but emphasize it as the partner of the municipality. Therefore, in my view, generally, traditional leaders are excluded from decision-making, which then invariably fuels the tensions between traditional leaders and municipalities, leading to an unhealthy relationship or relationships. And then I move on to the Spatial Planning, SPLUMA, which is the Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act of 2013, which is another important law that impacts or tries to define a role for traditional leaders, particularly in land use management. Before this act came into effect, traditional leaders were the primary authority for the allocation of land use rights in terms of customary law in the rural areas. Now, SPLUMA compels municipalities to adopt wall-to-wall land use schemes. Now, what is a land use scheme? A land use scheme, for those who might not be familiar with it, a land use scheme is a planning instrument that regulates or governs the use and development of land within a municipal area. These land use schemes are instruments through which land use rights are granted to successful applicants who submitted land use application. Therefore, with the SPLUMA, the traditional leaders' exclusive control of land use in their areas of jurisdiction effectively ends. But then the question that I raise is, does that mean that if the traditional leaders are exclusive control of land use in their areas of jurisdiction ends, does that mean that municipalities then have the exclusive control of land use in areas governed by traditional leaders? As we all know, they do in the urban areas, but then in areas governed specifically by traditional leaders, do they have exclusive control of land use in those areas? And these are some of the questions we're going to touch on as we move along. Traditional areas will now be included in these land use schemes, and municipalities must adopt spatial plans and land use management for the schemes in terms of SPLUMA. Now, I argue that land allocation, which is the power that is exercised by traditional leaders, should be construed as a form of land use management. I know there are planners in the room or in the audience that might disagree with this, but hear me out for a minute. SPLUMA, on the one hand, empowers municipalities to administer land use management throughout the Republic. A traditional leader, in my view, exercising his or her powers over land in terms of customary law is carrying out a form of land use management. In the rural areas, this power is referred to as the land allocation power. Now, I argue that once an allocation of land has been made, it is automatically accompanied by a set of land use rights. These land use rights include the right to build a homestead, a right to erect a kraal for the safekeeping of livestock, a right to access agricultural fields for the growing of crops, etc. As I mentioned earlier, this means that the process of allocating land by traditional leaders should be construed as a form of managing the use of traditional land. For example, a traditional leader, after consulting the community, would decide with his or her council which allocations of land use are permitted where. I'm sure we have the chief in the room. I'm sure he will agree with me or disagree with me that this is how it actually happens in practice. Therefore, allocations of land for a homestead, for example, would be placed far away from homelands, rivers, or areas prone to floods or fires. Once again, the chief is in the room, and he may guide me on whether this is a correct interpretation or this is what actually happens in practice. But I do remember that before the colonial era, this is one of the considerations that would be taken into account when land was allocated to a new applicant. And if you think about it further, the manner in which the houses in the rural areas are designed during those times, because an invasion or an attack in a kingdom could happen at any time, the design of the houses was made in such a manner that if there is an invasion that has taken place, then they will be able to defend themselves. And that is reflected with the manner in which the houses are located. And that is why I say times have changed. Of course, we have seen some traditional leaders do not take into account these considerations. They would make an allocation in areas that are prone to disasters or near the wetlands. So I recognize that times have changed, and some of these customary principles, which necessarily pointed into the safety of the community and the welfare of the community, are not necessarily taken into account nowadays. Before we move on to SPLUMA, the legislation itself does not necessarily mention the role of traditional leaders. It mentions traditional areas and how these areas must be dealt with under the framework of SPLUMA. But then when you move into the regulations, that is where you find an attempt by SPLUMA to define the role of traditional leaders and set out the role of traditional leaders in as far as land use management is concerned. Therefore, according to sub-regulation 19, which is under regulation 19 in the regulations of SPLUMA, traditional leaders are invited or encouraged to form working relationships with municipalities by entering into service level agreements. Now, these service level agreements are similar in nature to, for example, your memorandum of understanding. And in terms of these service level agreements, traditional leaders, as it says in regulation 19.1, will be allocated functions, provided those functions do not include making a land development or land use decision. Now, I pose the question, is this a problematic section or is this intentional? Now, in my view, it goes both ways, and we'll see later on. One aspect of it is that it is a problematic section. I argue that it is difficult to imagine that, which functions, planning functions in particular, that will be allocated to traditional leaders without them having to make a land development or land use decision in that regard. So it excludes decision making, but then it allocates functions which exclude decision making. So it is a problematic section in that regard. Or we could use the contextual and holistic interpretation, which would then, if you would read this section with regulation 19.2, and then maybe it would give us a different interpretation. So what is the alternative? Sub-regulation 19.2 allows traditional leaders to continue to allocate land and provide proof of the allocation of land in terms of customary law applicable in that area. Now I pose the question, which sub-regulation between 19.1 and 19.2 would traditional leaders choose? Sorry. In my view, of course, it would be option 2, because traditional leaders, they retain their power to allocate land and still remain the custodians of the land. Therefore, the question which this webinar seeks to address is why are traditional leaders vehemently objecting to the implementation of SPLUMA in their areas? There are a number of reasons as to why traditional leaders resist the implementation of SPLUMA. We had undertaken a study to go and find out the causes and the reasons as to why the implementation of SPLUMA was so opposed by traditional leaders in their areas of jurisdiction. Now, there are a number of reasons or observations that we picked up during our interactions with various traditional leaders in 3 different provinces, municipal officials, municipal planners, provincial officials. Yes, I think those were the stakeholders that we interviewed. But I isolate 2 for purposes of this webinar because of time limitation, is that one of the observations that we picked up from the interviews that we conducted was that there was a misunderstanding of SPLUMA in that our respondents said that it seeks to take away the power of traditional leadership to allocate land and vest it exclusively to municipalities. There was also the reason as to that there were inadequate consultations at the national level with traditional institutions, and therefore they resist this law because of that. Now, moving forward, explaining the misunderstanding of Spuma further. So one of the traditional leaders we spoke with in Limpopo during an interview said the following when we asked them as to why they were opposing the implementation of Spuma in their areas. So he said that on this issue of Spuma, in the House of Traditional Leaders in the district, there is a very loud cry. Why? Because the municipality will have to allocate stands for those people. It goes hand in hand with the issuing of proof of residence. Immediately, if the municipality takes over those things, it means there is no more power in those traditional leaders. We are there to only manage the land, allocate people land, and try to collect as little as we can. If you strip them of that function, it means you have just killed those traditional leaders. Now, of course, as I mentioned, we did not only interview traditional leaders, we also interviewed national government officials who were involved in the rollout of Spuma. And this is what that official had to say in response to the opposition of Spuma and to the opposition of the implementation of Spuma in rural areas governed by traditional leaders. This is what he said. He had had a bit of context. He had had a meeting with the late Zulu King when Spuma was being rolled out. They had undertaken these meetings because of the huge backlash that was surrounding Spuma after it came into effect. So he said, this is what he said in one of our meetings. We had a meeting with the late Zulu King in 2016, and the first thing he said to us was that this Spuma is another attempt to take away his land, and he won't allow that. Therefore, you can see that the misunderstanding of Spuma was an observation that we picked up not only from the national government officials, but also from the traditional leaders that we interviewed. Well, I move forward, and because of time, the good news is that, in my view, is that Spuma does not, in fact, seek to take away the power of traditional leaders. I'm sure some in the audience will agree with me, and some will lynch me or disagree with me when we open the session for discussion. In my view, it actually seeks to integrate the two systems of land use management. And then I ask the question as to why. This is the reason as to why. You get a proof of land allocation must be provided by the traditional leader. This means that an applicant who wishes to be allocated a plot must first approach the traditional leader of that community. In my view, this means that traditional leaders should be construed as the authorities of first instance in their areas of jurisdictions, in their areas of jurisdiction, in terms of receiving a request for the allocation of land. Municipalities, on the other hand, are the authorities of first instance in terms of receiving formal land use or land development applications. Therefore, in my concluding remarks, I pose the question as to what is the way forward? How do we avoid future contestations between traditional leaders and municipalities? How do we deal with the current contestation as it pertains to the implementation of Spuma between traditional leaders and municipalities? Therefore, I thought about this and I said, the word cooperation, it's thousands and thousands of articles that have been published over time, and some of which, and most of which I've read. The word cooperation is always used as the instrument, or the tool rather, that can traditional leaders and municipalities use to work together and avoid contestation or tensions between the two. Then I looked up the Oxford Dictionary as to what is the word cooperation, because it's been used for such a long time, and sometimes we lose the meaning of the word or what it actually means. Therefore, the Oxford Dictionary said the meaning, the word cooperation simply means work jointly towards the same end. And I argue that in the context of this intersection, which is the role of traditional leaders in land allocation and the role of municipalities in land allocation, the word cooperate deserves or screams or calls for a definition. So I define the word cooperation in the following manner. Traditional leaders, in my view, also, let me start again. Cooperation, in my view, is an end product of a process. If you want two people to cooperate, there's a process that takes place behind closed doors or even in open doors as to what it is that they need to cooperate on. And then they agree on that, and then they would cooperate at the end. So with respect to this intersection, information is very important. Traditional leaders are complaining that they do not understand what SPLUMA means. They do not understand what land use schemes are. They do not understand what spatial development frameworks are. And as such, they feel belittled because they do not understand it, and therefore they cannot engage properly with the municipal officials. And therefore they've called on municipalities to provide them with the relevant information in the languages that they speak or in the languages that they understand, so as to at least find one another in terms of understanding what these concepts presented in SPLUMA mean. And then after that is done, I then argue that we then move on after you've given them the information of what this means, and then you can capacitate them, which is now deals with empowerment. This then means you invite them into meetings and explain to them how the areas could be developed under SPLUMA. For example, we take the example of densification. We know that development has to start small, and then it spreads and spreads and spreads and spreads. And that speaks to the issues of resources, because if an area is far away from the municipality, it would cost a lot of money. You know, for example, a municipal official could tell the traditional leader, if your area is 2 hours away from where the municipality is, it would cost me 100,000 to connect the electricity to the grid of the municipality. But then if it's 30 minutes away, meaning that we start small, then it would cost me 5,000. I think in those terms, then traditional leaders could understand, and that is how you capacitate them, meaning you empower them. And then the own product, the traditional leader would then, okay, I agree with this. Let's then cooperate and put this plan into motion or put this plan into action. So that is why I argue that cooperation in this sense needs to be redefined and be seen in this slide that I am sharing. And they look no further as to what cooperation can do, or the lack thereof can do in the real world. I use the example of the KZN example. If traditional leaders had been given the information and they were empowered to understand that that this land allocation power and what it means, the recent KZN disaster could have been minimized or averted, because you had seen that other houses allocated in flood in places where the floods were prone, and in other places the stormwater drainages were not available, and therefore you find that the floods and then the houses were damaged and people lost their lives. It also holds the benefit, of course, that I've spoken about, of unlocking more development, because now you get to plan for these areas, and we know where to plan and the money that will be used for those areas. So it speaks to the IDP in terms of unlocking the development of the rural areas, with municipalities working hand in hand with traditional leaders. My parting shot is, shouldn't traditional leaders and municipalities, as the most important stakeholders at the local level in rural areas, be the bastions of democracy and development? Thank you very much. Dr. Michelle?
Thank you so much, Xavier. Thank you for taking us through the legal developments of, and helping us to better understand the changing role of traditional leaders over time. It has always been said in local government circles that local government is the sphere that is closest to the people. And so it is usually said to be best equipped to deal with issues on the ground. But in some instances, as you've rightly said, the traditional authorities are even closer to the people because those are the communities in which people live. And also they have a certain way of life and a certain way of decision making and processes. So I'm really happy that today, instead of just focusing on what we know from the law, we also have an opportunity to get an understanding of what is happening on the ground. And for this, I'd like to invite Chief Joy. If you can please give us some perspectives. Is it just an issue of not knowing the law, not understanding the law, which I doubt it is, but are there more issues behind it? What actually happens in practice when we're looking at this intersection between the role that traditional leaders play and, on the other hand, the role that the municipality plays? So you are at the coalface, and we're happy to hear what you have to say about this.
Greetings, Michelle. Greetings to my fellow panelists, Xavier and the Prof. Greetings to guests on this platform. In reality, actually, Xavier has just shortened my discussion by 90 minutes, so to say. He has put it out exactly and on how things are on the ground, but in the practical sense of what is happening, it is that as we are much more closer to our communities, traditional leadership is a recognized institution. In that effect, there is a traditional council that is also recognized. There's a new act currently, Act 3 of 2019, TICLA, Traditional Leadership and Cohesion Act of 2019, that we lead by in our communities. What would happen practically is that in that rural community, for example, a request for a residential site would be, and a person would go to a subheadman in their area, in that immediate community, requesting for a site. The subheadman would then come to the headman. The headman would call that community, requesting also for other people that would be requesting for sites, whereby they would then come with a list of people that would be requesting for sites. What would then happen is that the headman would come to the traditional council. The traditional council, as Xavier has mentioned, has got land allocated, in terms of spatial planning, whereby there'd be land for residential area, land for grazing, land for commercial use, land for agricultural use, so and so, to an extent of an industrial area, whereby it will be huge land. Now, the person what would happen is that they would be given a site within a residential area, of which what would happen, we would then call the Department of Agriculture. That is the previous laws. We're still using that even currently. We would call the Department of Agriculture, who will then assist in demarcating sites. They would basically come and look for any issues if the area is closer to a river, if the area is an area that is prone for disaster and whatnot. Then final approval would be received from the agricultural official, then the traditional council will then proceed with allocating those people that have requested for land. Even for commercial use, a person would come to the traditional council requesting for the land that they have noted, of which the traditional council would go to that area to look if that area is conducive for whatever business they would need. Currently with SPLUMA, it is definitely watershedding all of those powers. What we basically wish for is to have the final say in whatever decision that we take within jurisdiction, within the traditional council jurisdiction. Other people would say that traditional councils have a sense of imposing laws to people, of which is not the case. As I've mentioned, it would come down from your most immediate households. They would come to the headman, come up to the traditional council, using customary law that is actually managed, or we act as the custodians of those laws within our areas of jurisdiction as traditional councils, as traditional leaders. And traditional councils have a composition of having your 60%, of which will be appointed by a senior traditional leader. Your 40% will be elected by the community within that traditional council land. So now what we don't understand is then why is it, there's no misunderstanding as such, but why is it then the powers are given to municipalities, whereby we have to draft a letter to the municipal manager, who then maybe forward it to the mayor, who will bring it into council, where a decision needs to be taken concerning land within the traditional council. As we watershed our powers, eventually traditional leadership will be definitely rolled out. From our observation, from what we see practically on the ground, what can happen is that the municipality could deploy an official with the expertise on how to administer land. As mentioned, we can be capacitated by those officials who would then be able to assist us in demarcating certain portions of the land, of which was the case previously. There was assistance, and there is still assistance from the Department of Agriculture, instead of actually giving all the powers to municipalities. We cannot then say that we will accept first instance where a person will come to me and then I will then forward it to a municipality. The municipality will take the final decision. It can't happen in that way. And I wish to also bring it to your knowledge that most of the floods, most of the areas that were flooded in KZN were areas under councillors, your municipal councillors. It is land that is closer to your urban areas. An issue that I've noticed was that municipalities, when people come to erect squatter camps, what they then do, they come in and roll out infrastructure, be it your roads, be it your electricity, without even actually doing any spatial planning for those areas, proper spatial planning. So hence, the many areas that were flooded are areas closer to your towns, well within municipalities, your offices, so to say, in your squatter camp areas. So now, in just completing it, there's an issue of being recognized by legislation, but underneath the carpet, we are not given those powers. We are not recognized officially and practically. It's just only on pen, on paper that government recognizes traditional leadership. But at the very same time, that very same recognition, those very same functions, those very same powers are then handed over to your municipalities. Understanding that we are well within the same department, of which is COPTA, but there is no cohesion as such. There is no cooperation, but only to find that our powers are slowly but surely being watershed. Our recognition is so slowly and surely being compromised. So what we wish for is that to be recognized, where we are given powers, as I've mentioned, previous powers that we would offer the sites, or we would seek guidance from your Department of Agriculture, but now we can then forward it to the municipality rather, who will then deploy an official who would assist us with the certain expertise that they have on land allocation, of which the municipality does have your planning, your town planning department, does have your infrastructure department that can link with the traditional council. Thank you. Hence, I mentioned that my discussion was definitely shortened by Xavier in outlining most of the issues that we face in our areas. Thank you, moderator.
Thank you, Chief, for your presentation. I was telling Xavier in the chat that I was expecting to see a very old chief, but I'm seeing a very young chief who is around my own age. So it's great to see the other side of things. I think we tend to make assumptions based on the limited knowledge that we have. But when we have an opportunity to engage with the reality and the actual practice of what's happening, I think that's very interesting. Thank you very much for taking us through the actual steps of what happens. And it seems like a system that creates for checks and balances along the way, because going from the individual to the headman to the community, and there are just so many processes that are involved. So now we've had an opportunity to hear what's in the law, and we've heard what's actually happening in practice and some of the concerns that have been raised there. I'd like to now invite Professor Jaap de Visser. If you have, I'm sorry, if you could respond to both of the presentations, please, before we go on to our question and answer section. And also thank you. I've seen some comments and questions in the chat box. Please keep them coming. We're going to respond to them after Professor Jaap de Visser's presentation. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks to my fellow panelists, Chief Ngoyi and Xavier and Michelle. If you were waiting for someone old to take the stage, let me then be the old person, and I'm not even a chief, so I'll fill that role gladly. No, I'm very happy to be part of this discussion. I think the points that Chief Ngoyi made and the brilliant presentation that Xavier delivered really set the stage for a very, very interesting discussion. And I'm very proud that we're having this discussion. I'm proud because there's not many people, many scholars that are engaging with this in the way that we're doing it right now. And I think that's very positive. And I'm very also proud of Mr. Poswar, who is my PhD student, for delivering such a clear and insightful presentation. So Xavier is on his way finalizing his PhD, and I'm very confident that his work will make great impact on this debate. So yeah, I'm very happy to be part of this. Now, this is of course a very big and difficult debate. You know, there's a huge context to this that Xavier alluded to. There is the history of traditional leadership and all the trials and tribulations that it has undergone under colonialism and apartheid. There is, of course, the Constitution and the transformative effect of our Constitution. And let's not forget to mention also the role of women in these issues. And, you know, traditional leadership is well known for many things, but it's perhaps not well known for, you know, empowering women, which is also something that I think is part of the mandate of traditional leadership, and also plays a role in these discussions. We may not be able to unpack all of that today, but I think it's an important context. And I also saw in the chat box, I think, an invitation to a conversation about this, and I think that's crucially important. Also, part of the context is the capacity and the proximity and experience of both traditional leadership as well as local government. And I think the chief made very clear reference to this, the proximity of traditional leadership to communities. Their traditional leaders know what is important and how their communities function, and what is needed in those areas. And I'm reminded of one conversation that we had, Xavier, with an official in the provincial government who acknowledged that, you know, let's say the democratic or formal state institutions such as provincial governments and municipalities would never be able to plan rural areas with the kind of detail and attention that traditional leaders can. He said we would never be able to do that. Because you know, he was explaining that, you know, the headman or the chief would make allocations, you know, very precise, very particular, based on his or her knowledge of that specific area, and we could never replicate that in a municipality, let alone in a provincial government. So the issue of proximity, capacity. I mean, the law, as Xavier explained, places municipalities in a very prominent and, as some would argue, let's say a bigger role than traditional leaders when it comes to land use management. But we also have huge capacity challenges in municipalities. We have rural municipalities that are literally on their knees and that are subject to all kinds of political infighting and interventions and financial mismanagement. So that's all part of the context of what we're discussing. Nevertheless, I think that the legal and constitutional position in the history was very clearly outlined by Xavier. So it's a big challenge. It's a constitutional debate and it's a historical debate. And you know, I think for a long time, I think many of us sort of took the position that this is one of these stubborn problems that we will never be able to solve. It's just a standoff. It is just one of those problems that we will not be able to solve. And I think we need to move beyond that. We need to move beyond this supposedly insurmountable contestation between traditional leadership and local government on this issue, and seek some wisdom. I think was also a point was made in the chat. You know, we are not alone in this. This problem is not unique to South Africa. There are many countries on this continent that are working their way through similar tensions between indigenous communities, traditional communities, and let's say formal local governments, particularly on land allocation issues. I think we need to learn from that. This particular study didn't focus on that, but there are many other opportunities to do that. And even beyond the African continent, there are many jurisdictions across the globe that are finding their way through, you know, the combination of indigenous authority, customary law, and you know, statutory or constitutional considerations. And we need to seek guidance from, you know, concepts such as legal pluralism and legal integration, How do we integrate legal systems that emanate from various sources, be it customary, be it statutory, be it constitutional? I think we are able to do that, and we can derive a lot of wisdom from the practical systems that are being developed on the ground. And I think the chief gave us some very good examples of that. I do want to also mention, let's call them the outliers. Let's call them the unwieldy examples of land allocation or development approvals, in inverted commas, that are granted by traditional authorities in haphazard ways. That also happens. There are lots of records, lots of research done on developments being granted by traditional leaders on dubious grounds, and the practical impact of that is tremendous on municipalities. And this may be also partly an answer to the question that the chief asked about why. Because if a development is being initiated without the involvement of the municipality, ultimately the municipality is going to be severely impacted, because it will have to, at some point, if not immediately, deliver services to that development. A road network, sewerage, water, electricity, and it falls within the jurisdiction of the municipality and within the mandate and duty of the municipality to deliver services also to those developments that happen without its involvement. So I think that's an important consideration that would, I think, bring municipalities very clearly into the picture. There's also developments that happen within municipal jurisdictions on customary land, and we're not actually talking about sort of the kind of residential development that we've talked about until now. There are big mining concessions being given. There's malls being built. There is mansions being built. And some people have even told me that people choose to build their mansion in a communal area, because then they can escape the property rating by the municipality, and they'd rather then choose that route. So that is not good. And I'm not saying that happens all over, and that is how we should view these things, but I think it's an important consideration of the practical impact of unwieldy, let's say, unwieldy decision-making on development that ultimately becomes the responsibility of the municipality, and also the impact on communities of mining deals being struck without the involvement of the communities and municipalities. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on bringing these two institutions together in the space of land use management. And Xavier and I have had many discussions about, what could be the leading principle? What is the guiding principle for this? Borrowing from legal pluralism, the combination of law emanating from different sources. But there's also maybe lessons to be learned from very straightforward planning practices and planning principles. I've always found it very interesting, looking at the very practical example of the fact that when you want to develop a certain area, you want to engage in certain development, you are going to need certain approvals. If I want to start a liquor store in my suburb, I have to make sure that I have the land use management approval by the municipality, either through the zoning scheme or a special approval. But that doesn't get me there. I still need to apply for a liquor license, which is another department somewhere else in government. And both of them can say no. The municipality can say no to my plans to start a liquor store, and the liquor license board may say no to my plans to start a liquor store. And the fact that they can both say no doesn't mean that that's necessarily a problem. So I've asked Xavier often this question, how is this really any different? Maybe I'm simplifying it, and I will readily admit I'm by no means an expert in traditional leadership. I'm looking at this, sort of as an amateur, so I'll be the first to admit. But how is it really that different? Maybe it's a case that both institutions, traditional leadership and local government, can both say no to certain developments. which means that if you want to do mining in a particular area that's controlled by a traditional leader, or you want to establish a certain development, a mall or residential development, you need the approval of the traditional leader, but you also need to make sure that you fit within the land use management scheme of the municipality, and both institutions can say no. But the one institution cannot impose development on the other. It is not fair if a municipality is confronted with development that it hasn't planned for, that it hasn't budgeted for in terms of bulk services, in terms of its integrated development plan, et cetera, et cetera. So could that be a leading principle? It's not either or, but it's and. And maybe a combination of that with recognizing legal pluralism, that both institutions have their own source of authority and can exercise their authority, but both within the constraints of the Constitution. So I think what's good to mention, I think it was also mentioned in the chat somewhere, that traditional leaders have by law the right to be represented on municipal councils, up to 20% of the municipal council. They can be traditional leaders that participate in council meetings. Of course, it's a complicated system because there may not be enough seats for all traditional leaders in the municipal area, but there is that system of representation on municipal councils. And what impact does that have? Does that help to bring the two institutions together, also on these very practical issues of land use allocation and land use management? Of course, municipal councils do not take land use management decisions per se. They would adopt a land use scheme, but they are not supposed to, at least, be involved in the day-to-day land use management decisions. So the impact of the collaboration there between traditional leaders and municipal councils is then also limited. But it's an interesting concept. Does that help? I know that in certain parts of the country, traditional leaders still refuse to participate in municipal councils because they don't have voting rights, and they feel that this is a demotion, this is an insult to their authority, that they have to sit in municipal council meetings and be almost sort of inferior to municipal councillors. So I think that's a very important dynamic. And there's a debate now, I think, within the implementation of SPLUMA, of if we have these municipal planning tribunals, these tribunals that municipalities must establish to take land use management decisions, comprising of outside experts. Councillors may not take a seat in those tribunals, and these tribunals must take land use management decisions. Is there an argument to be made that traditional leaders must be represented on these municipal planning tribunals that will take town planning decisions in the municipal jurisdiction? So I think that there are areas where we can look beyond the contestation, beyond the standoff, and beyond the complex history, and look pragmatically at how can we collaborate? How can the two institutions collaborate? What are the avenues? Xavier made some very good examples and good suggestions of how we can interpret and implement the SPLUMA regulations. So I think there is a way forward, but of course, what is important for that is that there's conversations, there's dialogue, and there's a coming together, and there's a recognition of the authority of both institutions, and a recognition that the one doesn't muscle out the other. And just like many other jurisdictions in this continent and elsewhere, they can collaborate, they can work together for the benefit of their communities. Thank you so much, Michelle. Let me leave it at that, and I'm really looking forward to the debate and what others still have to say. Thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you very much, Prof, for a very interesting response to those conversations. And I think what really stands out is that you flagged there's some key emerging issues that actually also come into play when we look at the relation between traditional authorities and local governments. You raised important issues about development, and the issue around mining. These are all land-related issues which come to the forefront. In the discussion, we also heard issues that lean towards the climate change. We also heard about the issue of gender and land. So there are different angles and different issues that all come together and have to be figured out in a way by understanding how best to bring together the traditional authorities and municipalities. So for those that joined in the middle of the conversation, we've heard from Xavier on the developments of the laws around traditional leadership, that legal framework. And then we've also heard from Chief Joy about the procedures and the practicalities of land allocation, for example. And now we want to open the conversation up for questions and answers. And I picked up a few in the chat box. So I'd like to direct these ones to Xavier, if you may. And for those that do have questions, please feel free to continue putting them in the chat box. So I'll ask a few questions. We'll take a round of questions, and then we'll allow the presenters to respond. And then thereafter, we'll take another round of questions. So the first question is for Xavier. I think you've alluded to some of this, or you've responded to part of this, but you can elaborate. What law regulates traditional leadership from portioning land and selling it off for particular uses? Should they use sploma, and how? And the second question is, the contestation between traditional leaders and municipal authorities is not unique to South Africa. In your research, did you also look at other countries, and do you have any comments from other jurisdictions? And then for Chief Joy, first a comment. It says this misunderstanding between traditional leaders and municipalities is amazing. Both are sitting in municipal councils and they take decisions collectively. Is there room? So the question perhaps to draw from this is there room for some sort of improving or increasing the role that traditional leaders can take in that space within councils? In your opinion, what could be some of those ways? And then the next question is, as Prof. Yap commented on in his presentation, there's always a question on gender when we look at traditional leadership. And so there's also perhaps a contestation that if land allocation is conducted or finalized, the final decision is made at the local government level, as opposed to the traditional authority level, there is more opportunity for fair allocation of land between men and women. Whereas if it happens in the traditional or cultural processes, there is a risk that there may be a bias towards men getting allocated land or getting allocated the better land. What are your comments on that? Is that just speculation, or are there any systems that are in place to respond to that? Perhaps Xavier and Chief Joy, you can respond to those questions, and then we'll take the next set of questions.
Thank you, Michelle. I didn't get the first question because my internet is unstable and it's waning at the moment. But I got the second one, which is about the contestation, whether it's unique to SA or are there any other jurisdictions which are dealing with the same issue, and whether we focused on other jurisdictions in this study in particular. Well, as Prof. Yap has alluded earlier, other jurisdictions are grappling with the same issues that we have raised in our study. But then our study was limited to South Africa because it was, or it still is, a burning issue in provinces where the institution of traditional leadership is present. So even our study, we limited it further to only 3 provinces. We didn't, for example, go to the Northwest in Mpumalanga because of resources for starters, as well as all because it was it's a PhD study, which we didn't want to expand and make it a 400 type of document. But to answer your question, basically, we did not focus to other jurisdictions as yet. But as Prof said, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in focusing on other jurisdictions. I'm sure there's other lessons that could be learned, which could be beneficial or applicable to the South African scenario. Thank you. It was only two questions. Yeah. Thank you in the meantime.
Thanks, Xavier. The first question related to the law that is applicable to in relation to portioning of land and selling it off by traditional authorities. Is there another law? Should they rely on Spluma?
Yes, there's one law that comes into mind. It is which is also relevant, but it doesn't necessarily deal with land use management. So we didn't go into detail into that, but it is mentioned in our study. It is I think it is the State Land Disposal Act, and there was a recent policy that they issued, which is the State Land Disposal Policy. Basically, what it says is that because traditional leaders are custodians of the land why is KwaZulu-Natal always in my mind? Sorry. Because our traditional leaders are the custodians of communal land, and the relevant minister or the government holds the title into that land, any sale or transaction or the lease of the land must be, if I'm correct, Nkosi Joy can correct me in this regard, any communal land that can be transacted on or leased must receive the approval of the government before that land is released for that particular development. I think Prof. Joy mentioned the Department of Agriculture in the Eastern Cape. So yeah, there are other laws which intersect which can be used in conjunction with Spluma when it comes to the transaction of communal land and releasing land for development. Thank you.
Thanks, Xavier. And Chief Joy?
Thank you. With your municipal councils, Prof did mention this, that we don't have any voting powers. So a discussion can formulate, and we will not have any powers to vote on it. A discussion can be on an order paper, but we can't post our views on it. So that is the issue that we face within your municipal areas, within your municipal councils as traditional leaders. So and also another issue that we face within these councils is that there are more urban area councillors. So they would not understand customary law, or how is it we came to decide on within a certain area that it should be demarcated for whatever is of our interest, or even the process, the customary process. They definitely will not understand with it. So it would be a matter of customary law with that issue. And then what I also wish to emphasize is that, there's a recognition of traditional councils. So as government recognizes traditional councils, decisions on land should be taken in those traditional councils. As I had said, that we should get advice from your municipal officials, being your town planners and whatnot, assisting us. I also wish to emphasize that within the traditional council, we've got your community developmental workers as ex-officio members. We've got your councillor of the area of that ward within the traditional council as a representative of the municipality, of which we also form part of the IDP. So all of this planning can actually be coordinated to form part of the IDP of that municipality. instead of taking those powers to the municipality, but a discussion could be formulated, it could be part of the IDP, and then going into council. Also, I wish to emphasize that, yes, I understand that previously there's been issue with women being allocated land, but currently the provincial house, the local houses, the provincial houses, and national house of traditional, these are all houses of traditional leaders. They are assisting in capacitating traditional leaders with all of those issues that were there previously. And within our customary law, in reality, there's nothing that really mentions that no woman is allowed to have land. It was more of having a man to represent that woman. But we are slowly but surely pushing that out as traditional leaders. We understand that we live in a democratic state. We are in a democratic dispensation. So we need to be democratic in certain processes that we have within our areas. So yes, traditional councils should be the last ones to have that final say, getting guidance from the officials, from the people that have the expertise. Thank you.
Thank you very much for responding to those questions. We have a few more questions. So to Xavier, whose role is it to capacitate traditional leaders was one of the questions in the chat. And someone also commented, it's very interesting to hear the process that was outlined. It would be helpful if this process was standardized in traditional areas and also monitored. So I think for Chief, could it be standardized? There are different traditional communities across different parts of South Africa. Do you think it's practical to standardize across the different cultures, the different traditional authorities that are there? And then another question for you, Chief, is could you provide some examples on whether there's any proof of land allocation that traditional authorities have or can show that they've issued land allocation? Let me just take that again. Please give examples of what proof of land allocation the traditional authorities issue to land allocation beneficiaries. And are they hard copies? Are they recorded at the different traditional authorities? And perhaps for Xavier, or actually any of the panelists, how does this get linked back to the municipal land database? How do we connect the dots from the process conducted by the traditional authorities and linking it back to the municipal land database? There's also, just a moment. Okay, so let's take those questions. So first, Xavier, is whose role is it to capacitate traditional leaders, in your opinion? How does this work? And then the question for Chief is on the proof of land allocation. And yeah, let's take those. And then there are a couple more questions still. Thanks.
Thank you, Michelle. Is it fine if I keep my video off because my internet connection is a bit unstable?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so with the first question, whose role is it to capacitate traditional leaders? I would think it would be a collaborative role between national, provincial, as well as municipalities. Of course, traditional leaders and municipalities find each other at the local level, but COGTA as well could play a role in the capacitation of the provincial COGTA as well as the national COGTA. They could play a role in capacitating traditional leaders, but specifically at the lowest level, at the local level in particular, with spatial planning and land use management, I would think that the form of passing municipal traditional leaders would be to ensure that they attend to spatial planning, take them through several workshops in what
Sorry,
land
Xavier,
use scheme.
we
Yes.
seem to have lost you for a moment there.
Where should do you still remember the last part? Where should I continue from?
Just the last sentence, thanks.
Yes, so show them what a land use scheme looks like and explain to them that is basically about identifying what can be built where, and show them where their area fits into this land use scheme and what the plans of the municipalities are. I think that is one of the ways in which traditional leaders could be capacitated. And also another important issue is the language in which you present or you convey your information to traditional leaders. Of course, these are technical concepts which are foreign to people living in the rural areas, especially traditional leaders who may also be of older age, for example. So explaining in a vernacular language is very important as well, but also ensuring that they come into meetings and then you explain what these processes or these instruments mean for them. Yes, thank you. Michelle?
Thank you, Xavier. Sorry, yes.
There's another question I would like to answer because my internet connection is just yes. I think this one is by Prof. Krista Rottenbach. Krista, Prof. Krista, you're my personal friend. You're crushing with those articles. Thank you for being here today. Ooh. Anyways, so the question is on the powers of traditional leaders when people squat on land that is controlled by traditional leaders. In my view, and what we have encountered in practice is that it varies, Prof, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. You will find that in some places where people move in as squatters, a traditional leader has been chased away. But then what we find in Limpopo is that traditional leaders, because of the lack of cooperation or consultation between the municipality and the traditional leaders, they actually allowed people to squatter into those areas because they realized that the municipality would have to provide services to those squatters at the end of the day. So what they said was it would be better if they would cooperate with the municipality. They would police or for example, they would police the people who are moving into these areas who are moving into these areas, and then inform the municipality that there are people that have moved in, and this is the number of these people, so that the municipality can be aware before the squatters can actually engulf the entire area, and then could not be subjected to an arbitrary removal. So I think it depends from area to area, but I think the role that they play is a law enforcement type of role that they want to play. They want people that come into the areas to first go through the procedure of being recognized by the community and then establish the reasons as to why they are there. Are they not there to commit crime? So that is the procedure traditional leaders normally follow. But in some areas, traditional leaders, you'll find that they're being chased away, or maybe the chief is weak. Or sorry, I can't use that word for every chief in the house. Or but if the chief does not play a dominant role in respect of governing the area, then squatters are more likely to invade that area. I hope I've answered that question.
Thank you so much. Yes, you have.
And the last one.
Okay,
the last one. And the last one, this one goes to Celeste Domingo. It was a huge a huge text that she posted in the chat. I just want to show her this. This is the book that will answer all your questions there, Mrs. Celeste Domingo. This is the book that you need to get. I will write it on the chat. All your questions about heritage, conservation, as it pertains to traditional leadership, you will find it here. I'll post the name of the book in the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. I am sitting with our chief, who is also eager and has prompted me with those questions in the chat. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks for that input, Celeste. Let's also hear back from the chief on the earlier questions. Okay. And then we'll take the next round of questions. Please go ahead, Chief.
With the first question of capacitation, I think my discussion is more on the practicalities of what is happening on the ground, really. I came into my role as being a traditional leader in 2013 within Bazia, and within the area of Tata, that is where we're located here in the Eastern Cape, of which I was only capacitated by the Department of Cogta in 2018. It can leave much to your imagination if I had not understood what is it to do within your land allocation, that I could have made many mistakes from 2013 to 2018 within those 5 years. So there is definitely an issue, a crisis within our Department of Traditional Affairs in terms of assisting traditional leaders in being capacitated. They could actually even form a partnership with your local house, your local houses, your provincial houses, your national houses, on immediately capacitating traditional leaders that assume their positions within the very first couple of months before blunders occur. So that is the issue that we currently facing. Also, yes, your local houses, the second topic, the second question is, your local houses, your provincial houses and national houses can assist with standardizing certain laws of traditional communities, understanding that there's a constitutional constitutional law, and also there's your customary law. But all of that, your customary laws are under constitution. So we can be guided by that in standardizing a certain law that could be outcasted throughout the country. With your third question, yes, we do have a template. I can assist in forwarding a template that we use within our traditional areas in land allocation. Yes, I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for your responses. We're really learning a lot about the mechanics of how this all comes together. And I've given Prof. Yap a long break, and now I want to come with quite a few questions for you, if you'll allow. So the first one is really more of a policy question. It's a bit broad, and I'm sorry for putting you on the spot, but it's very clear, it's become evident that as we are looking at the issue of climate change, and it's sort of with the KZN floods, it's come very, very close to home. And the chief alluded earlier that there's cooperation, that if there had been cooperation between the traditional authorities and the municipality, some of the damage or the impact of the flooding could have been mitigated. Do you think there is any space for perhaps collaboration or working closer between traditional authorities and municipalities in addressing this issue of climate change or climate adaptation as we move forward? And the second question I'd like to ask, perhaps I'll direct this one to Xavier. On the issue of funding, there's a question that's been raised by Celeste about funding. Who actually, or how do we make sure that there are resources allocated towards financing the implementation of training and capacity building for traditional authorities. And then there's a question that's just looking historically, traditional authorities carried the responsibility of allocating land. So this is something they have been doing for centuries. Well, not exactly the same people, but for centuries. And so what is it that municipalities bring that's different from what traditional authorities bring that, that justifies taking away, reducing their role in the space of land allocation and shifting that role to traditional authorities? What is the basis, I suppose? I don't know if Prof. Yap, you want to attempt that one as well. And then we'll let Nkosi take a short breather. We can start maybe with you, Prof, and then we will hear from Xavier.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. Xavier was referring to Chief Joy earlier as Professor Joy, so I can now, let's swap titles, and it's Chief Yap and Professor Joy. Let's swap titles for this morning. I mean, you still have your elderly chief. No, all jokes aside, look, it's a fascinating debate happening here, and if we were able, the three of us, to answer all the questions in the chat, then we would probably solve this problem. And that was not the purpose of this webinar. We didn't set out to provide answers to all those very, very difficult but important questions that are put in the chat. But thanks so much for all the questions that you pose, and we'll try our best to give some observations. But clearly, this is an area that requires further research and further dialogue and debate, because it's clearly complex and very important. But so partly in response to your question, Michelle, I wanted to sort of emphasize two distinctions. The one is the distinction between ownership and land use management. And for better or for worse, the Constitution makes it quite clear that the two are not the same. And speaking from a urban point of view, if you are the owner of your piece of land or your house in an urban context, that ownership doesn't entitle you to do with that land as you please. There are still other rules that apply, land use management rules. I own my house here, but that doesn't mean I can do with it as I please. I have to stay within the limits of the law, within the limits of the zoning scheme, and within the limits of a range of other restrictions that apply to how I can use my land. And I think in the chat somewhere, somebody made the point about there is sort of perhaps a bit of mischief also there happening where ownership gets confused, or communal use rights get confused with the right to do with that land as you please. And that applies to no one. No one has that unfettered authority. Whether you are a multinational owning headquarters in Sandton, or whether you are a traditional leader that is a custodian of a certain part of the land in a communal area, that authority is not unfettered. And I think that's also the background to what happened recently in the Supreme Court of Appeal, where you perhaps know the court case that KSAC launched against the intention of the Ngonyama Trust Board to convert PTOs into leases, and where Supreme Court of Appeal confirmed the High Court ruling to say that is not permitted. So I think that's a big debate, separating ownership and communal land use rights from land use management. The second observation I want to make is the distinction between spatial planning and land use management. And I think that's an important area also to be clear on what the distinction is and what opportunities that offers. So the municipality, as some of you have already referred to, must adopt a integrated development plan, and part of that integrated development plan is a municipal spatial development framework that applies throughout the municipality and sets out a spatial vision for that municipality, what the municipality intends to plan the municipal jurisdiction for. And that's a very important process that results in a series of maps and a spatial vision for the municipality, including the communal areas. And a lot of considerations ought to go into that process around heritage conservation, the development needs of the area, population development, engineering concerns, what is possible, what is not possible, climate change consideration in response to your question, Michelle. All those considerations must go into how the municipality plans, does the forward planning for that area. Now that ultimately is adopted by the municipal council, and traditional leaders must be consulted and must be part of that process in a very specific way, because they have that very special role that they play in their particular areas. And I think that's a very important process, and that's separate from land use management, which is because that plan that I spoke about, the municipal spatial development framework, it doesn't give any rights. It doesn't give anyone any permission to do anything with a specific piece of land. It is a policy statement. It is a forward-looking policy statement. But separate from that is then the land use management, which is the actual conferring of land use rights through a zoning scheme or through specific approvals. And this is then done by the municipality in terms of the Constitution. And here the Constitution made a hard choice. And if we want to change that course, if we want to change that choice, we have to change the Constitution. Because the Constitution says municipal planning, which is this conferring of land use rights through a zoning scheme or specific decisions, is the prerogative of the municipality. And we now have about 7 or 8 constitutional court judgments that confirms that it is the municipality's jurisdiction, it's the municipality's power. So it's very difficult to remove that power from municipalities or to tinker with it without changing the Constitution. So I think it leaves us with the question again of how do we bring the two systems together? And the municipality, the traditional leaders play a crucial role in the management of communal land use rights. And I think I certainly am not by any stretch of the imagination an expert on that. There are people in this room that know infinitely more about how that works than I do. But there is also the municipality's role on municipal planning, and how do we establish systems, practices pragmatically where the two institutions work together. I think that is the big question that confronts not only us this morning here in this webinar, but of course on the ground in municipal areas and traditional areas, those institutions that are faced with those issues. So yeah, with those two general comments, I wanted to respond, Michelle, because I think there are so many questions, and I certainly am not able to answer them, all of them, with the detail that would do justice to it. So back to you, Michelle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Very much appreciated. Xavier, there was a question earlier. I'm not sure if your connection has stabilized now. There was a question on financing. On financing training. There's also a comment that speaks to, or that suggests or proposes that perhaps additional lines of funding can be provided by COCTA. What are your thoughts on that funding for particular items like auditing or training and so forth? I think that was the earlier question I had asked. And there's also now a question for Chief that's looking at who is actually sitting in municipalities. And the comment is that the majority of people that are working or that are councillors in some of the provinces, in many of the municipalities, are actually also people that live in rural communities. Does that make any difference when it comes to working together between the traditional authorities and people that are actually from their communities being councillors in those areas, in the same in the same geographical area? So let's hear first from Xavier, and then we can hear from the Chief. And again, thank you, Prof, for your insights. We may have to start with you, Chief. I think Xavier is still trying to get his connection established. Chief Joy. Okay, in the meantime, I think let me take this chance to maybe pose another question. Are you there? Oh, okay.
Yes.
Please go ahead. So the question, I'm not sure if you were able to hear me earlier.
Kindly repeat, ma'am.
Okay, the question was about building building cooperation between councillors that actually come from the same rural areas as the traditional leaders that are in that geographical area. So is there any way to foster relations, a better working or cooperation relationship between the traditional leaders and specifically councillors that come from those traditional areas where the traditional leaders are in authority? I'm hoping that I've asked this question sufficiently clearly.
Okay, no, thank you. I
Yeah.
heard you very most definitely that can be done. We can definitely find a synergy in working and building good relations in whatever programs we would work on. The only issue that we currently finding on a number of topics besides Bloomer is understanding your roles, but roles are clearly defined within our certain policies that govern us, be it your municipal structure acts and your traditional leadership, your current one, TICLA, Traditional Leadership and Cohesion Act. Everything is jotted down there. It's just that we need to understand traditional leaders need to be capacitated on that. Even municipal councillors need to be capacitated on that. There are traditional leaders who may not understand the act. There are municipal councillors who may not understand the act that governs them. So they definitely can be a platform of seeking synergy and working well in hand. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I think we can now take the last round of questions and then we'll allow the presenters to give their final remarks. So the last set of questions come back to you, Chief. One is in relation to civil society organizations and contestations around traditional leaders having undemocratic practices. Okay, so the comment says, let us not overlook issues raised by civil society organizations on undemocratic practices of traditional leaders on land held under customary tenure. This ranges from community land governance to engagement with, for example, mining interests. And the next question is, would the traditional leaders be open to a practice where the municipality, in partnership with traditional leaders, can plan land development, some form of land use scheme in their areas, and the traditional leaders allocate land according to those plans? So these are just a couple of questions for you, just keeping in mind the distinction that we heard from Prof, the distinction between spatial planning and actual land use management. Are you there, Chief? We seem to have lost him there. Okay. So let's see, perhaps we can redirect this question.
Can I try?
Yes, Xavier, please go ahead.
Yes, yes. Can I try and tackle the question with my limited knowledge?
Yes, please. With your vast knowledge, please go ahead.
Yeah, so the question is whether would traditional leaders be open to a practice? Because we conducted interviews in the East with traditional leaders in the Eastern Cape, Limpopo, and KwaZulu-Natal. In some of our engagements, traditional leaders were open to such a practice, and they even termed it a land use scheme within a land use scheme, right? So you would have the land use scheme of the municipality, but then you would have a land use scheme which applies to a particular village or an area that is under the control of a particular chief. So they were open to those innovations, but then again, it goes back to how the traditional leaders or the relationship the traditional leaders have with a particular municipality, and they've described it in terms like the municipality in those areas. I'm not saying in all areas, but the municipalities in those areas would always move from a position of imposition in saying that the Constitution recognizes us and we're the one with the resources, all sorts of antagonistic language. And then traditional leaders would then say, it's fine, you continue with whatever you need to do with your spluma. We will continue whatever it is that we have been doing for the past 100 centuries before, even before the advent of colonialism. So the practices are there, the suggestions are there, the innovations are there, even suggested by traditional leaders themselves. But then it is the will to cooperate, the will to consult one another, the will to understand the position one or the other institution is emerging from. So yeah, you do find these innovations in practice, but then in terms of how they are shaped and how they are carried out in practice, it is a totally different matter.
Thank you so much, Xavier. I think on that note, if there are no other burning questions, I think that this takes us towards the end of the conversation. I'd like to kindly ask our presenters if you can maybe in 1 minute just give us your final remarks, taking into account the conversation, the rich conversation that we just had. And we'll start with Xavier, and I'm not sure if the chief was able to reconnect, but if he's there, we'll go on from Xavier to chief and then to Prof. Yap. And just a reminder to please fill in the evaluation form. The link has been shared in the chat box. So Xavier, just some final remarks from you, please.
Yes, just two quick points in my view. Whatever is going to happen with the current contestations depends on the relevant parties and other parties that are affected by it. But what we need to recognize, or some people have already recognized, is that the Constitution, in a series of judgments, is starting to elevate customary law, and that has important consequences in terms of how we're going to interpret the powers and functions of traditional leaders moving forward. So the law, the black letter law, as it applies, for example, if Spluma says a particular thing must be done in this way, in the urban areas, it's easy for it to apply because the system allows it for it to apply, because land use management instruments have traditionally applied in these areas, but in traditional areas, it has not. So the black letter law should not necessarily be applied in the same manner that it has been in urban areas. And now what we are going to see moving forward is a customary law that is in sync with the Constitution, and that is what we find in the recent judgment of the Constitutional Court. And importantly, that is what we're going to find in interpretation of the powers and functions of traditional leaders. Of course, those powers and functions need to be subject to the Bill of Rights and the Constitution in general. The other point I wanted to make is the SLAs, the service level agreements. I think that is another important tool which can define the relationship, planning on the land use management relationship between municipalities and the traditional leaders in the rural areas. How that will be structured or what should form part of those SAs will vary from province to province, and it will depend on a case-by-case basis, because these two institutions, they need to negotiate and come up with locally negotiated solutions which will fit the context in which they emerge from. So those are the two main important points that I wanted to my parting shots that I wanted to share with the audience.
Thank you so much. Prof, I don't see the chief in the room. Maybe you can also share your concluding remarks, please.
Thank you, Michelle. I will try to give that parting shot, and apologies for the noise in the background. There's some gardening happening in the background, which may interfere with the sound. But yeah, just to reiterate, maybe I think the principle that is established by the Constitution, that we ought to perhaps move away from the either or question, and maybe this is partly also in response to Nifa's point about where he asked the question, what is it that municipal councils can do that traditional authorities cannot do? And I think that sort of is asking the either or question. And my careful response to that would be that maybe the Constitution demands more of us than wrestling with the either or question. The Constitutional Court has been quite emphatic on many occasions where it has admonished organs of state for not collaborating and saying, you basically saying, you guys need to work together. You are all part of the state. You all have your own authority. You're all responsible towards your constituencies, towards your communities. You must work. You owe it to communities to work together. And perhaps that also applies to traditional leadership and municipalities. Because if we were to answer the either or question and say, well, all those considerations that go into managing land use and planning land use must then shift from, let's say, from the municipality to traditional leadership or traditional councils, then it means that we must charge traditional councils with all those considerations around heritage, conservation, development needs, engineering, population development, climate change, water management, that all of that must then shift to traditional councils when it comes to communal land. And I think the Constitution demands differently. It demands that traditional authorities, traditional leaders, traditional councils, and municipalities and other organs of state from their respective positions and their respective knowledge and mandates work together, as hard as that may be in practice. And we've heard from Chief Joy that, in practice, it is possible. There are gaps, there are difficulties, but slowly but surely we are, practices are emerging of collaboration. So that is sort of my parting shot. But again, it's work in progress, and it's a very complex and difficult area. And I'm very grateful to be able to be part of this conversation with so many wise men and women in this room. So thanks very much for your participation, and yeah, to be continued. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you very much to both Prof. Yap and Xavier for your parting words, and also to the three panelists, including Chief Joy. Thank you so much for helping us to understand. You've taken us, Xavier, from the development of the law, the legal framework on traditional leadership. You've helped us to understand the frameworks, the different applicable rules. We got to understand the practicalities from Chief Joy of what actually happens in practice. And we also got to hear about, I think, a thread that runs from Xavier's presentation on the importance of supporting, of support, assistance, facilitation, recommendation, and participation and how that sort of feeds into the importance of the recognition of traditional leaders that Chief Joye was speaking to, and the importance of their role and the importance of cooperating when it comes to what is sometimes called complex intergovernmental problems, where there's a problem that can't be just solved by one, like the KZN flood. And also, I think very beautifully concluding with your remarks, Prof. Yap, on it's not about either or. We really have to think deeper into how do we bring it together to make it work. It's not about bringing it apart. It's a system that's been designed, and the Constitution has made it so that we make the two systems work together and function together. On that note, I think we've had an enriching conversation. Those that came in knowing nothing about traditional leadership or municipalities, I think we can all safely say we have a much better understanding. So I'd like to thank our presenters. I'd also like to thank all our participants. Your questions were very valuable, and we appreciate the comments that you've shared with us. Please also remember to fill in the evaluation. And finally, I'd like to extend my thanks to HSF South Africa for your partnership and for your support. Otherwise, everyone, have a lovely day. And thank you again. Let's keep this conversation going and make sure that we improve the cooperation and support between our municipalities and traditional leaders. Thank you, everyone, and good afternoon.
Thank you, Michelle, for a very, very competent chairing of a difficult session. Thanks so much. Well done.